Hey everybody, welcome to another installment of Ask Chuck Dixon, number 34. This is where you ask me questions about what I do for a living, and what I do for a living is I write comic books. So let's get right to it, shall we? Kiefer Riley Johnson says, I would like to know more about the behind the scenes of the General Grievous comic you did. Yeah, I did a General Grievous miniseries for Dark Horse. And it was funny because Star Wars was a franchise I enjoyed up to a point, um, but I never had any desire to write it. I kind of wanted it to just be something I watched and enjoyed and wasn't involved in creatively. But they approached me about doing it, this Grievous miniseries, and I had seen the character on the Clone Wars animated shorts that had shown up on the Cartoon Network by Tartakovsky, and I was really impressed with all of them. And I really thought General Grievous was cool. I didn't understand that he was going to be part of the live action movies, the prequels. But when they approached me, I thought, yeah, he's a cool character. I got even more interested when they told me that Gary Oldman was going to provide the voice for him. I don't think that turned out to be the case in the end. I never saw his name on any of the credits. So they went in another direction, I suppose. But I thought it was cool. Kind of imagined Gary Oldman's voice in my head, and I didn't know much about the character. I only knew that he was sort of respiratorily challenged. He's had some issues dealing with the organic parts of his robot body. His body was barely bionic, and it all went very well. The only glitch for me was there's a sequence on an ice planet, and I wanted it to be Hoth, but the Lucasfilm people said it couldn't be Hoth because that was not revealed yet, which I didn't quite understand, um, because the prequels were made after, obviously, the original film series. So everybody already knew about Hoth, and didn't Hoth exist at the time of the prequels? But who's going to argue they owned it at the time? And it worked out great. I was real happy with how it turned out, and Dark Horse was real happy with how it turned out. And of course, it had absolutely gorgeous artwork by Rick Leonardi. So everyone was pleased, and it gets reprinted often, which pleases me. No end. Um, it's kind of a standalone miniseries. It can be read on its own. It doesn't require you to read anything before or after it. And it was kind of fun to play in that universe for a little bit, make up a lot of those crazy names and situations and vehicles and things like that. So there you go. Drew Geraci, my buddy Drewby, he says, question for Ask Chuck. If you got to write a prose novel of a DC or Marvel superhero not associated with Batman or Punisher, what characters do you think would be most fun? Um, boy, I can only think of writing Punisher novels. I can't think of writing novelizations. Um, I don't think I could do the fan service to a superhero prose novel. I really don't. It requires a certain level of dedication, maybe a certain level of geekiness that I'm not willing to step across that line. So yeah, I mean, if I were ever offered any chance, it would only be the Punisher. And I know you didn't want to hear that, but that's the case. I can't think of another character at Marvel or DC that would interest me to write in prose. To me, they are comic book characters first and foremost. And of course, the Punisher, his origins really come from the men's adventure paperbacks of the 70s, the Executioner and the Destroyer and things like that. That's really his birthplace. He's more akin to one of those characters than he ever was to a comic book character. So of course he would lend himself to prose more than any other. There's people that write that stuff better than I could. Is the short answer, I guess. Of course, I write my own novels to scratch my Punisher itch. My Levon Cade novels. Former Marine. Sounds familiar, right? Former Marine, trying to live his life, but he always runs across a problem he just can't walk around. And complicating all of this is he's a single dad with, well, by the time of the seventh novel, two young daughters to take care of. And if you want to find out more about that, read the books. I'm working on the 8th one right now. The title is Levon's Hunt. Okay, Dwayne Thomas, shoot 'em up, Dwayne, says, Chuck, what do you think of DC Comics in one fell swoop canceling 25% of their line because it was losing money? I have taken to calling it DC Implosion 2. Well, DC Implosion 1 was bad enough. In the 70s, DC laid off 40% of its staff, began canceling books, and kept because sales were horrible and shrinking fast. And they were trying anything but not everything to save themselves. And DC, things really don't change very much. Companies tend to stay the way they were created for some reason. They develop a personality, a corporate culture, and a spirit that just seems to live on no matter who's running the place. DC was always a hidebound company that resisted change and could never understand that things had to change in the business in order for you to survive. So they did only the most pragmatic or practical things. They didn't really think outside the box. So they began to economize by jamming a whole bunch of books into one and charging $1. The dollar price kept them on the newsstand because one of the things that was hurting their sales was a lot of newsstands were rejecting comics because they were cheap. They were taking up space that more expensive magazines could occupy. They were taking up some valuable real estate there on the newsstand, so they were nixing comics, reducing their orders of comics. To stay on that place, DC, increased the size of a lot of its comics, raised the price to $1, which was closer to like the cost of a copy of Newsweek or Time magazine, so that these comics could earn their place on the newsstand and therefore keep sales going. But it really wasn't enough. But of course, being DC, they just doubled down. And they began to come up with these treasury editions, these monster-sized comics, which took up this enormous amount of real estate on the newsstand. But they caught the eye. You couldn't walk away or couldn't walk past the newsstand without seeing them, because they were just these huge comics. And Marvel tried the same thing. And as you see here, DC and Marvel even teamed up together because both companies' sales were failing. It was a higher price point and it was a bigger book. And, I guess they were successful for a while because they did quite a few of them. But like anything else that kids get interested in, the thrill was gone after a few years and the sales began to fall even on these giant-sized treasuries. And the thing is that back then, at least, there was one difference at DC. They were concerned about sales. They were concerned about the bottom line. The most critically acclaimed comic they were doing in this period, and critically acclaimed, what did that mean in a 70s comic book? What it meant was that the New York Times Book Review did a article about this comic. It was Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and it was DC's attempt to do something relevant. Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams. These stories are considered classics by some and sort of pandering by others. But they've dealt with a lot of political issues from a more liberal perspective. They tried to be controversial, and therefore they got noticed by publications by the New York Times. And fans, comic fans liked them because it was Neil Adams, and he was hot at the moment, and they seemed kind of edgy. So the older comic book fans liked them. Who didn't like them was everyone else. This run is called legendary and groundbreaking and everything else, but one thing it wasn't was a bestseller. This was the absolute worst seller that DC had, and they only kept it around a little while because it was getting media attention. But once that attention faded away, and it always does, they canceled the title and just went back to regular Green Lantern stories, which of course began to sell better. Now, during this slump in the 70s, slump in sales where they weren't really making much off of comics, they were struggling to survive, there was income. I mean, they had TV shows on, cartoons on Saturday morning, and you see the beginning of mass marketing of superhero toys. So there's licensing money coming in from everywhere. Then you had the Superman movie and the rest of it. But it's really not enough to keep Um, Publishing happy. I mean, licensing coming in, that licensing money, that's great. But the publishing end has to make money on its own. And you've got to pay people to write and draw the comics and everything else. Well, why keep doing that if they're not making any money? And DC really didn't know what to do. They were at a loss as to how to keep going. They kept trying things that failed, trying things that failed. Meanwhile, over at Marvel, Marvel's going into the magazine business, which they were already in anyway. Marvel was part of a much larger magazine conglomerate, which produced, men's sweat magazines and men girly magazines and things like that. So it was nothing for Marvel to move over into comic book magazines, kind of copying what Jim Warren was doing and a few other publishers were doing. And they had some success, but mostly failures. Most of these magazines didn't last very long. Savage Sword of Conan would be the exception to the rule. But they tried everything, and I guess it kept them afloat for a while. Things like Deadly Hands of Kung Fu and their horror magazines and things like that. It kept the artists and writers busy. It brought money in. It kept them vital. But it was something that DC sort of stuck their toe in the water a little bit, but it wasn't their thing. Magazine publishing was not a thing DC was interested in, so they just didn't do it anymore. Now, through all of this, everybody's trying to reach the kids. Everybody's trying to get to the kids, get to that newsstand where the kids first see it. Where we were back in the day, that was the first place we ever saw a comic book, was on the newsstand when our parents took us to the drugstore or wherever. And, we saw these, colorful little magazines, and we either got interested or we didn't. This was the entry point. Well, newsstand wasn't working for the big companies. And out of the blue, they kind of got rescued by the fact that there's dedicated comic book shops popping up here and there, and the beginnings of a direct market. And in the 80s, they lean hard into the direct market. They decide this is where they want to be. And this is going to be the answer to everything. But of course, it isn't. And the mistake they made was they retreated from the newsstand. They left the newsstand to concentrate almost solely on direct sales and comic book shops. Well, the problem is that nobody ever sees their first comic book in a comic book shop, because nobody walks into a comic book shop cold. You really need to be introduced to the comics in another place. And a lot of the retailers were not very forward thinking, and they would complain to DC and Marvel about newsstand distribution, that they thought that it was taking sales from them. Well, it wasn't. It was, that first shot of heroin, that first bag of free candy. That's what was at the newsstand. That's what was going to get the kids interested in the medium. And then a certain percentage of them were going to love comics so much that they would seek out a comic shop. But without the newsstand, there is no entry. And so they kind of skipped the generation of readers there by retreating from the newsstand. And a little more of that later. The other thing they thought was going to save them was trades and hardcovers. Well, we know how that goes. They're just as likely to suffer sales slumps as the regular periodical comics. And then you end up with warehouses full of unsaleable trade paperbacks and hardcovers, and the retailers end up with storerooms full of unsaleable trades and hardcovers. Another big answer to everybody's problems was going to be digital. We used to call them comics on the moon at CrossGen, because it was a pipe dream. Digital, yeah, they certainly do sell digital comics, but they in no way, or at least not yet, have they replaced print versions. They're not profitable enough to do digital only comics. They just don't sell enough. I mean, they sell in the aggregate, they make money. They do particularly well for DC. It's one thing that DC does right. They have virtually everything they've ever published up on digital. So there's a huge, enormous selection. So just by sheer quantity, they make money. But I know from my own royalty statements based on digital sales that it's up and down, up and down, up and down. And I apparently do well on digital. Digital's great because it's democratic. You're voting for the comic you want. you can pretty much look at everything at the side. It's like a penny candy counter, and you pick the candies you like and don't take the ones you don't. So I generally do well, but it varies widely, and I haven't noticed any upward trend over the years. I haven't noticed that my royalty checks from digital getting any appreciably larger over the years. So I don't think this is an answer. I mean, maybe everything is an answer. That just try everything, and it certainly is no reason to abandon digital. It's certainly profitable, but it's not going to save the industry. Now, the problem at DC, as I said, they were hidebound. There was a period in the 90s where there was a magazine group which was putting together magazines for juveniles. And they would do Barbie magazines and Nickelodeon magazines and Spider-Man magazines. And they also did a Superman and Batman magazine based on the Superman and Batman cartoons that were airing on Fox at the time. And these magazines did very, very well. The only problem is that Marvel, who was suddenly flush with cash in the 90s, bought this magazine company. And they began packaging. Now, see, DC didn't package these; they simply provided the material, and the packager did it. And one of the good things about these was that they actually had comics in them. So kids were buying a magazine with comics. Children were getting a magazine with comics in them. Well, anyway, Marvel bought the magazine line. They began packaging all these. Well, DC didn't want Marvel packaging any of their material. It's kind of weird, but they didn't. They did, even though they were getting a licensing fee. So they backed out of the deal. They said, no, we're taking Superman and Batman out of your lineup. Now, several people involved with creating material for this, because they created brand new material for these magazines, they approached the powers that be at DC and said, we were selling a 500,000 copies a month of this magazine, 500,000 copies. It was technically DC's biggest selling title, probably the biggest selling title they'd had in decades. And it was getting into the hands of children. I mean, this is a returnable magazine that was selling through at about 500,000 copies, I think, every other month. And the artists and writers who were working on creating the material for this said, well, why don't we continue the magazine done by DC? And DC said, we're not interested, and we don't have anybody to do that. now you have an entire production staff creating comic books, dozens and dozens and dozens of comic books every month. You couldn't add one bi-monthly magazine to that group. Maybe take on one more employee to get that 500,000 in sales every other month. That's what I mean by hidebound thinking. The kind of hidebound thinking that that I've told the story before, but there was a week a number of years ago, in the same week that Darwin Cook, and unbeknownst to him, myself, approached DC about an all ages comic, a comic for kids, a comic for young adults. And he wanted to do Wonder Woman. I wanted to do Kamandi, the last boy on earth. I mean, is that a young adult title or not? It's the concept is in the title, and it has talking animals in it. I mean, wouldn't tweeny girls go crazy over Kamandi, the last boy on earth, and all of his talking animal friends? Seemed like a natural to me. But both Darwin and I were told the exact same thing. We're not interested in that audience. And both of our replies were exactly the same as we compared notes later. You mean you don't want the Harry Potter audience? And they said, no, we don't. We're not interested in that audience. We're interested in, I don't know what they're, grown-up fans. We're interested in our aging fan base heading into its 40s and still buying comic books. And that's an enormous problem. Now I hear DC's getting into young adult area, but typical of DC, the young adult gold rush is over. It was a thing. It lasted for a long time, but it's waning now. And of course, that's when DC decides to get into it, when the idea is getting tired. Now, the thing is, yes, DC has an extraordinary amount of success with licensing in entertainment, ancillary entertainment outside of the comic books. They've done Boffo business with Batman movies and a number of other movies. Some earn more than others, but in general, the DC comic movies are a profitable venture. Same thing, they're all over. I mean, is there any hour of CW programming that isn't based on a DC comic book? I don't know, but they're getting more exposure for their characters than they've ever had. I mean, these characters are becoming household names when, only 30, 40 years ago, these characters were only known to, geeky comic book fans like you and me. But now they're household names and popular and reaching a wide audience through movies and television and games and all the rest of it. Enormously popular. And that's a cash flow for DC. Unfortunately, DC is owned by Warner Brothers Pictures, who produces every single one of these movies, television shows. So Warner's gets to make the big money here. Now, a number of years ago, Warner's renegotiated with DC a new licensing deal, which severely cut into the amount of money that DC has paid in revenues based on movies and television. Um, and, that gets handed down to creators. So if you create something and it gets turned into a movie or television or show or cartoon by Warner's, you're not getting anywhere near the kind of money that they used to pay out to freelancers, because you're getting a piece of what DC gets, and what DC gets from Warner's has been appreciably chopped down. And that's a shame, and that's one of the problems of working under one of these big multinational entertainment conglomerates. They just reach in and crush you. I mean, them negotiating with DC for net receipts is like the mafia negotiating with the candy store owner. Nice little store you got here. So DC had no power in those negotiations. And you didn't have a real powerful leadership at DC at the time. What Warner's did to DC in that period, I cannot imagine Paul Levitz or Jeanette Kahn would have let them do. Would never have let them get away with it. But they did. And it hurts everyone. It hurts DC itself. And because they're under more pressure than ever to make money as a publisher. And it hurts the little guy, the freelancer. And in the end, they abandon the kids. That's the biggest problem. How do you get those kids back? How do you get those kids back reading comics? I don't know. I don't have all the answers to all of this. But the thing is, they purposely, walk away from the kid audience. And they do these big events, these big confusing crossovers that are aimed at basically to get the retailers to buy a lot of number ones. 52 all new number ones. And the retailers go, ooh, I want them all. Because, enough readers always buy the number one to keep, moving the engine along. So, really, in an instance like this, DC is marketing its comics to the retailer. They're not even marketing their comics to their own audience, because it's easier to figure out how to order a crossover or an event. It's a problem. Another problem is hyper-politicization. You want to reach out to the kids, but you also, like back when they did Green Lantern and Green Arrow, they like that media attention. But now they seem to think more of the media attention than they do of sales. So even when the media attention is great, but nobody buys the comic, they still keep going for the media attention instead of concentrating on doing quality comics. Plus, when you do political stunts like this and go for the media attention, you're turning off half your audience because they don't want this. And I think more than half your audience, because even people who might agree with you politically don't necessarily want politics in their comics. They prefer their comics apolitical. But this, like I said, companies don't change. DC has a personality, and they've always, for some reason, from the 70s on, been attracted to the political. They did an anti-gun ownership comic in the 80s, Seduction of the Gun. In the 90s, they did a comic book against landmines. And the thing is, in both instances with these were um, driven by Democrat politicians. One of my editors was editing the landmine comic, and he says he was hearing from a Democrat senator almost every day because the senator didn't understand that it took months to produce a comic book. And this senator demanded to see pages, within, days of the assignment being given to the writer. I mean, this guy he's not real bright to begin with. And it was funny because this editor was so proud to be talking to this Democrat, and he's very much a Democrat supporter, but he got sick of hearing from the senator day after day after day, and I found that kind of funny. But there you go. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we got a new implosion, and honestly, I don't have the answers. I know what you shouldn't do. I know they got to try something different than they tried before. And I know they got to bring in some new people with some new ideas because letting the same people make the decisions every time and failing time and time again, that's not an answer. So when I first heard about the round of firings in DC, I was hopeful. But then when I saw they were doing, politically oriented comics, more of them leaning into it, I thought they haven't changed. Nothing has changed. And the comics are just going to get worse. And the sales are just going to go down more and more. So got to get the kids back. Got to get some quality in there. Do good comics that kids will enjoy, stuff that's different and new and fresh, and it can be done. Ben Baker, when writing adult dialogue, how do you deal with swearing? I'm sure a bunch of mafia goons under attack by the Punisher would likely drop a few F-bombs. Do you prefer using things like rabbit, racking around with fake swear words, or ignore them altogether? Yeah, there's a way around these things. You know, I generally don't like a lot of cursing in comics, and it's kind of silly to replace it with this kind of stuff unless you can be creative about it. But I can generally work around it without using it, without even implying it. So I don't really have that much of a problem. It just comes with doing, you know, I think if you get to use swear words, it becomes kind of a crutch. It kind of takes over your dialogue. I don't think I would write a better story if I was allowed to write swear words. I don't feel held back. I just have to be more creative with the dialogue. And I mean, I've always thought that because, back in old movies in the 30s and 40s, you got all that clever dialogue, and a lot of it was designed to get material past the censors. I mean, the characters are talking about things that they're not really talking about. There's a scene in The Big Sleep where Bogart and Bacall are having a conversation about horse racing, but they're not talking about horse racing. And the audience knew it. They were Air Force jokes. We called them Air Force jokes because they went right over the kids' heads. But the adults would get them. I remember when I was a kid, sitting in the theater, my dad be laughing at something. I said, "What's so funny? What's so funny?" He said, "I'll tell you later." And he never did. Uh, yeah, I don't feel like I need to do that to make it realistic. Now, there was one book that I wrote, one comic that I wrote, where, yeah, it was a problem. And that was the Nam. There was a sort of a patois, a language, a shared language in the troops in Vietnam. And it included, because they were military guys, a lot of blue language, a lot of cuss words. And there's sort of a rhythm to it. And that was hard to reproduce. And you couldn't reproduce it with the squiggles, the phony cursing, or any of the rest of it. So I just sort of played around with language. So characters would, call each other muffers. Well, the reader knew what I was trying to say. So, and I also would adjust words like cluster bump. Something was a cluster bump. And I thought that's close enough. But the thing is, by being able to put in those words, which were just nonsense words that sounded something like what the words would in real life, I kept that rhythm. I kept that. It seemed like a more honest exchange. of how these guys talk to each other. And for me, that's everything. I mean, you can get the guns right and the period right and the uniforms right and everything else, but you got to get that language right. You got to get that period language, that like I said, that shared patois right, and then it seems believable. Then it seems real. And in a story like the Nam, the four-letter words were essential. So I had to figure out a way to assimilate them um, into something that would pass the comics code. Speaking of comics code, for a long time, when printing was bad, comic book printing was bad, there were two words that were banned. You were never allowed to use them in a comic. You were never allowed to name a character Clint. And the word flick was strongly advised against because printing wasn't good and letters would run together. So, yeah, think about it for a minute. Ben Baker again. When writing your ongoing books, how do you leave certain plot elements unresolved so they can be picked up in future books, but still make it satisfying in the moment for the reader? Well, there's a lot of things you can do with subplots so the reader doesn't feel like they've been shortchanged. Like, this scene wasn't utterly pointless, like the last season of Fear the Walking Dead that had so many utterly pointless scenes in it. You want to basically, the thing you got to watch for is if you're advancing your subplot with a scene, you've got to have an ending for that scene. Because you got to let the reader know the scene's over. So something has to happen at the end, and you can go for a cliffhanger. That's typical way to end a subplot sequence. Hey, come back next month, or come back in 4 pages and see what happens. You can end with humor. That's way to end the scene. You can just cut out with humor, or a big reveal, something about the subplot that the reader didn't know before, and that kind of ends your scene and leaves the reader wondering what's going to happen next. Now that I have this information, or you can reinstate the character's emotional state at the end. Something happened in the subplot that upset them, and they're going to let you know about it. And then of course you have to resolve every subplot. If you create these subplots, you have to figure out how long you're going to let them run. Is it going to run 2 issues, 3 issues, 4 issues? And certainly by the end of a trade paperback, all of your subplots should be resolved. And so you got to be thinking of the resolution. But yeah, just think of them as scenes. Think of them as vignettes. And a vignette is an enclosed story of its own. And so your subplot is a series of vignettes. It's a series of these little stories that all connect into one story. And if you think of it that way, you'll always write something that satisfies the reader at the moment. And it's like, yeah, I don't know everything, and I know there's more to the story, but I got to see something cool or funny or that I didn't know before. So there you go. Something they can emotionally connect to. Ben Baker again. It's a Ben Baker triple spin. Does it feel weird inheriting characters from previous writers, then have them do things that you think make sense, but that their original creator may not agree with? How does it feel when you create a character like Bane and you see him written by other people? Is it easy or difficult to accept the things they have him do? I don't pay attention after I've created a character. I really don't. But I know how it is on the other side of the aisle. I had a terrific run with Nightwing. I got a fantastic editor, great creative team, and I had a lot of fun. And we all were very successful in what we meant to do. I mean, it's of all the things I've done, I think this is one of the most beloved runs I ever did. Was my run on Nightwing. It's the one I hear about most often from fans. People really dug it, and for me, that's a creative highlight. That's cool. It was successful. Everything worked. Everything clicked. But I didn't create Nightwing. Certainly didn't create Dick Grayson, and I didn't create his Nightwing persona. That was Marv Wolfman back in Teen Titans when him and George Perez took Dick Grayson, the Boy Wonder, and turned him into Nightwing in his disco outfit. And that's cool. I got to work off of what they had created. I got to build off of what they did. I worked in their shadow, right? Well, one time I was deep in my run on Nightwing, and it was popular. It was selling well. I was at a convention. I was seated at the DC table, one of the DC tables, next to Marv Wolfman. Okay, so we're signing books, and we had met before. We were friendly enough. We weren't best pals or anything, but we'd met a number of times. We were convivial, and but readers kept coming up with issues of Nightwing to sign for me, and I'm signing a lot of Nightwing in front of Marv Wolfman, and I'm signing and I'm signing and I'm signing. And after a while, he and I aren't really talking anymore. And finally, I turned to Marv and I said, Marv, I feel terrible. I feel terrible. I said, you created this character. You named him. You gave him the persona. You know, whatever. You grew Dick Grayson up. And here I am coming in, you know, late to the game, and I'm having all this success with what you created. And Marv said, I am so glad you said that. He said, that was so nice of you to acknowledge that. Because he said, so many creators don't. They don't remember what came before. And I said, well, I always try to remember what came before. And I said, particularly when the guy is sitting next to me. So, you know, I'm glad I spoke up and said something, and it made him feel better, it made me feel better. And that's the way it should be. So there you go. Yeah, I really don't care what happens to my characters after they've gone off with another dad. but but I'm very conscious when I'm working on something created by somebody else that it was theirs first. So there you go. If you, like Ben Baker, have lots of questions that you would like answered by a working comic book professional, you can contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. Contact me directly and fire off some questions, and they will show up here on Ask Chuck Dixon very soon. And also, if you like this video, let others know it, because YouTube will share those likes, spread it around, and hopefully monetize this channel so it's worth my time to do it. So it's not just fun, it's also a profession, and I can spend more time and maybe even do more than one video a week. What do you think? So like the video. If you know someone else who might like it, why not share it with them? Just kind of help me spread the word. It doesn't cost you a single penny. Well, that's it for now. Keep the questions coming, and I'll keep the answers coming, and I will see you all down the road.